Es wird nicht geklatscht, okay.
Guten Abend und herzlich willkommen im Literaturhaus und ebenfalls sehr herzlich willkommen im Stream. And I'm very warm welcome to Celeste Ng. It's a huge pleasure to have you here tonight.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I would like to welcome Edred Hasler as well, who is going to be the moderator tonight, and Pilo Lidlow, who will be the German voice. Herzlich willkommen. Mein Name ist Gesa Schneider, ich bin die Leiterin des Literaturhauses. We are very happy to have Celeste Ng here tonight with her new novel Our Missing Hearts, Unsere verschwundenen Herzen, im DTV-Verlag erschienen in der Übersetzung von Brigitte Jakobeit. Vielen Dank an dieser Stelle an den Verlag für die schöne Zusammenarbeit. Celeste Ng was at Literaturhaus in spring or in April 2018, almost 4.5 years ago already, and it was with her novel Little Fires Everywhere, and it was such a memorable evening, and we are delighted to have her back. I really loved the novel Our Missing Hearts. I loved the main character Bird. I loved the storytelling, which touched something inside me and made me remember how my father used to read to my sister and me as children, and it made me think again of how fragile our current state of democracy is and how little it would take to overthrow it. But we will talk more about that tonight. The conversation will take place in English, the reading part will be in German. Edred Hasler will be our host tonight. He held a wonderful conversation with Valeria Luiselli a few years ago here at Literaturhaus, and the summer with Marlon James. He is Geschäftsführer of Swiss Culture Sociale und Mitglied der Literaturjury von Pro Helvetia. Both things difficult to translate. He's also one of the key figures of German-speaking slam poetry, and he's part of the moderation team of Literaturfestival Leukerbad. Pilo Lidlow was born in London and grew up in Köln and Frankfurt. She studied Schauspiel, so acting, at ZHDK in Zürich, Zürcher Hochschule der Künste. And now she's working in a slightly different position at Schweizer Radio und Fernsehen SRF, so we have a lot of people multitasking and talented in different fields. The book table today is from wonderful bookshop Pile of Books. Celeste Ng will be signing books after the reading, and she thanks you all for wearing your mask tonight. Und jetzt wünsche ich uns allen und Ihnen allen einen wunderbaren Abend.
Thank you so much, Gesa. My apologies beforehand if my voice sounds a bit hoarse. I do not have a cold, but instead I was at the championships of the German-speaking slam scene that just took place this weekend in Vienna. It is a great pleasure and honor tonight to be here and to introduce our wonderful author. Celeste Ng was born 1980 in Pittsburgh, a child of a chemist and a NASA physicist who had immigrated to the United States in the late 1960s from Hong Kong. She studied English at Harvard University as well as at the University of Michigan and has been a novelist as well as an activist her whole life. Her novels have been translated in dozens of languages as well as adapted for television, most recently Little Fires Everywhere, which was adapted into a miniseries by Hulu. She lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Her third novel, Our Missing Hearts, is a dystopian, although not as dystopian as we would probably like, envisioning of a United States where anti-Asian racism runs rampant and children, not only of Asian origin, but of anyone dissenting with the government, are robbed from their parents. Bert Gardner, a half-Asian child who goes on a fairy tale voyage to look for his mother, becomes the figurehead, mother who has become the figurehead of the ongoing protests against the government, using nothing but poetry, memory, and language as her weapon. It is a thoroughly touching, chilling, and yet deeply subtle text that speaks of crimes in an imaginary world that sadly have very real counterparts in our past as well as our present. Please welcome Celeste Ng. Took me some to get through that. I'm very sorry. I hope you're comfortable.
Well, now I'm not.
Awful of me. better or worse than last time you were here?
The same. It's really nice to be here. I remember actually loving the event that I did here at the Dorter House. I remember that the audience was just so thoughtful and they were so welcoming. I had never been to Switzerland before, so thank you for coming out tonight.
We try to be mostly friendly people. We'll jump into the novel, I would say, almost with a first reading by Pilu. Do you want to put it into some context at first?
Sure. The novel, as you heard, is about it's about a 12-year-old boy named Bird, and he's growing up right now with just his father. His mother is a Chinese-American poet, and she left the family some years before. So he doesn't know very much about her. He doesn't know exactly why she left. But he does know that he's growing up in a world where there's a lot of fear and where there are laws that say that you must be patriotic. And if you are not patriotic, if you don't protect American cultures and traditions, as the law says, one of the things that can happen is that your children can be taken away. And at the beginning of the novel, Bird gets a letter from his mother, and he hasn't heard from her in a long time. He's starting to think about her. He's wondering if he can find her. And she's on his mind, and he goes to the park, and he sees something strange. And I think that's a good place to hand to Pilu.
Ist auf dem Heimweg, als es sieht. Erst eine Menschenmenge, dann eine Gruppe von Marineuniformen und in der Mitte des Können, des öffentlichen großen Parks. Und eine Sekunde später sieht er nur noch Bäume. Rot, rot, rot. Von den Wurzeln bis zu den Zweigen, als wären sie in Farbe getaucht worden. Die Farbe von Kardinalvögeln, von Verkehrsschildern, von Kirschlutschern. 3 dicht beieinander stehende Ahornbäume mit ausgestreckten Armen. Und aufgereiht zwischen ihren Ästen, verwoben zwischen den sterbenden Blättern, ein riesiges rotes Netz, das in der Luft hängt wie ein Schleier aus Blut. Eigentlich muss er direkt nach Hause gehen und auf der Route bleiben, die sein Vater ihm vorgegeben hat. Quer über den weiten Platz zwischen den Laborgebäuden der Universität, dann über die Rasenflächen und auf dem Campus bis zu den roten Backsteinwohnheimen. Er soll sich von den Straßen fernhalten, so gut es geht, und möglichst auf dem Universitätsgelände bleiben. Das sei sicherer, behauptet sein Vater. Als Bird jünger war, hat er ihn jeden Tag zur Schule gebracht und wieder abgeholt. Nimm keine Abkürzungen, Noah, sagte sein Vater oft, hör auf mich. Versprich es mir, hatte er gesagt, als Bird anfing, allein zur Schule zu gehen, und Bird hatte es versprochen. Jetzt bricht Bird sein Wort. Er flitzt über die Straße zum Kommen, wo sich einige Schaulustige versammelt haben. Von hier kann er besser sehen. Was er für rote Farbe gehalten hatte, ist eine riesige rote Zierdecke aus Garn, die bei jedem Baum wie ein enger roter Handschuh über Stamm und Ästen liegt. Auch das Netz besteht aus Garn, rote Ketten, die sich kreuz und quer von Zweig zu Zweig spannen, an manchen Stellen zu Klumpen verdickt, an anderen zu einem einzigen Faden verdünnt. Verknotet in den Strängen, wie gefangene Insekten, Strickpüppchen von der Größe seines Fingers, braun und hellgelb und beige, deren Gesichter dunkle Garnfransen rahmen. Die Zuschauer ringsum flüstern und zeigen mit dem Finger drauf, und Bird schiebt sich vorsichtig in die Menge. Es macht ihm Angst, dieses Ding. Ein monströses Strickwerk, ein scharlachrotes Geflecht. Es gibt ihm das Gefühl, klein, verletzlich und schutzlos zu sein. Aber es fasziniert ihn auch, zieht ihn an. Wie eine Schlange, die einen nicht aus den Augen lässt, während sie sich zurückzieht, um dann anzugreifen. Eine Gruppe von Polizeibeamten umringt die Bäume und spricht aufgeregt miteinander. Sie zupfen mit den Fingern am Garn und diskutieren, wie sie das Ganze am besten entfernen. Zu spät. Ohne stehen zu bleiben, holen die Passanten bereits ihre Handys aus den Jacken und Taschen und machen ohne viel Aufhebens Fotos, die schon bald verschickt und gepostet werden. Die Polizisten unter den Bäumen umkreisen die Stämme. An ihren Hüften baumeln Pistolen. Einer schiebt sein Visier über den Kopf nach hinten. Ein zweiter legt seinen Schutzschild ins Gras. Sie sind ausgerüstet, um Gewalt abzuwehren, aber nicht hierfür. »Schert euch weg, Leute«, dröhnt einer der Polizisten und posiert sich zwischen der Menge und den Bäumen, als könnte er mit seinem Körper dieses seltsame Spektakel verdecken. Er zieht seinen Schlagstock, klatscht ihn auf seine Handfläche. »Das ist ein Tatort. Gehen Sie weiter. Das ist eine unerlaubte Versammlung.« Ein leichter Wind weht, in dem die Puppen hüpfen und schaukeln. Bird betrachtet sie, ihre dunklen Gestalten vor dem unschuldigen blauen Himmel. Die Umstehenden zerstreuen sich gehorsam, die Menge lichtet sich und erst dann entdeckt er es, in weißer Schablonenschrift auf dem Gehweg. Wie viele verschwundene Herzen noch? Daneben ein roter Fleck. Nein, ein Herz. Er weiß, es ist unwahrscheinlich, unmöglich, aber er sieht sich trotzdem um, über die Schulter, ringsum, als könnte sie hinter einem Baum oder einem Busch verborgen sein. Er hofft auf ihr Gesicht in den Schatten, aber dort ist natürlich niemand. »Geh weiter, Junge«, sagt der Polizist zu ihm, und Bird stellt fest, dass sich die Menge vollständig aufgelöst hat und er als einziger übrig geblieben ist. Er duckt sich, »Tut mir leid«, und zieht sich zurück. Und der Polizist wendet sich wieder seinen Kollegen zu. Streifenwagen mit Signallichtern blockieren die Straße an beiden Enden und leiten den Verkehr um, riegeln den Park ab. Bird überquert die Straße, trödelt aber und beobachtet die Szene verstohlen hinter einem geparkten Auto. Hatte seine Mutter gestrickt? Er kann sich nicht erinnern. Jedenfalls konnte es nicht das Werk von nur einer Person sein. Das Garn, das Netz, die wie überreife Früchte schwingenden Puppen, alles fest verankert, als wären sie wie Pilze aus dem Baum geschossen. Wie haben sie das Ganze befestigt? Fragt er sich, ohne genau zu wissen, wer sie sein könnten. Durch das Autofenster sieht er die Polizisten, die darüber debattieren, wie sie diese ungewöhnliche Situation handhaben sollen. Einer schiebt seine Finger in das Netz und zerrt. Ein dünner Ast bricht knackend ab. Es klingt wie ein Gewehrschuss. Eine einzelne lange Garnschlaufe hängt herunter, entwirrt sich Stück für Stück. Auch ein Bird knackt etwas und entwirrt sich, als er sieht, wie so etwas Zartes und Kunstvolles zerstört wird. Die Puppen zittern, gefangen in ihrem roten Netz. Seine Haut fühlt sich zu klein für seine Gedanken an. Da nimmt einer der Polizisten ein Teppichmesser und zersäbelt das Strickwerk langsam von oben nach unten. Das Garn fällt in einem Wasserfall aus losen Fäden herunter. Ein anderer kommt mit einer Leiter, klettert in die Äste, reißt die erste Puppe ab und wirft sie auf den Boden. Keine Puppen, denkt Bird plötzlich. Das sind Kinder. Die großen Köpfe, die pummeligen Arme und Beine, das dunkle Haar. Sie hatten Augen, aber keine Münder, nur 2 Knöpfe auf einem leeren Gesicht. Und als er sieht, wie der kleine Körper unten im Matsch landet, wendet sich Bird aufgewühlt ab. Der Anblick ist ihm unerträglich.
Thank you very much, Pilou. I mentioned it, and I had noticed, and I thought it quite odd that it was NPR, so the one public media station in the US who commented on this as well, that it is not a dystopian novel. You touch on a subject that came to quite prominence in 2018 when the Trump administration changed policy that actually had existed before that, as far as I know, but where they, for the first time, publicly separated immigrant children, mostly from undocumented immigrants, and there was an outrage. Was that the starting point for this novel? I know you became an activist on that as well, but
It really, honestly, it wasn't. This was a case where I had the idea, even before Trump was elected, I wanted to write about a mother and a son. My second novel, Little Fires Everywhere, has a creative mother. She's a visual artist, and her daughter understands her mother's art. Her daughter puts up with quite a lot to support her mother's art in that novel. And while I was finishing that book, I started thinking, what if there was a mother and a child and they didn't understand each other this way? What if there was a child who saw the art as maybe taking his mother away from him? So I had that idea, and while that idea was beginning to form, this was about October of 2016, and almost immediately thereafter, some things happened. We had a presidential election that I think shocked many people. We saw a continued rise of the far right. We saw a lot of increased public violence and hatred. And the idea that had been forming in my mind was based around my own feelings, which is, as a parent, one of the worst things I can imagine is to be taken from my child or for my child to be taken from me. So I was thinking about these things, and I had written them into the book, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to keep writing this book because it was so scary to think about for myself. And then when we started to hear in the news about the separations of migrant families and children being taken away, it then began to feel very important to write about the book. I had to write towards that fear because it was something that was happening in our country, and it was something that had happened multiple times before in the U.S. and elsewhere. It felt more important to not shy away. It gave me a little bit of courage to feel it was worth doing.
But you're saying basically it was not supposed to be a political novel, and you sort of unwillingly got drawn into this.
Well, I think we draw a distinction between it's often called sort of a family novel or a domestic novel, and then a political novel. And I think that border is actually much more blurry. When I published my second novel, Little Fires Everywhere, people said, you're leaning into politics. Are you doing that on purpose? And my thought was, yes and no. I think it's a family novel, but I think that a family novel is also political. I think my first novel was also political. This one is maybe a little bit more overtly political, but it feels to me like it all comes from the same theme. I think when you write about parents and children, which are what really interests me, that's inherently political because parents are raising the next generation of citizens. They are shaping the values of the children to come, and the children are the ones who are going to continue the path we're on, or they're going to decide to change it and go a different way. So I guess it was always a political novel. It just became obvious to everybody else that it was a political novel.
I just noticed that it sort of mirrors the story of the characters as well, who get drawn into it almost unwillingly. They sort of adopt certain causes on their way, but they don't really seem to have a lot of control over that.
I think that's right, and that is some of my experience as well. I don't think of myself as an activist. I just think of myself as somebody who cares and who wants to talk about the things that are important to me. But I think many people think of me as an activist because I do talk about these things. And that's a surprise to me. I think we should all talk about the things that feel important. And in the novel, Bird's mother, Margaret, accidentally becomes an activist. She writes poetry, and she doesn't think they have a political meaning, but other people read them, and in their minds it takes on a political meaning, and she has to deal with the effects of what they think. And I think that's some of my experience as well.
How difficult was it to find a tonality? As I said, to me, it was clear from, I don't know, maybe page 10. This is a deeply political text. There were to me a lot of resonances to Handmaid's Tale as well. And yet the tonality of it is much more subtle. There is no polemic. I might quote a part later. Actually, the librarians get to really comment, but
we'll talk about
librarians.
I love librarians.
Absolutely. Oh, I noticed. But how difficult is it to find a tonality that is not accusatory and yet suitable to the subject?
It took me a while. I think the tone that I ended up with is maybe more of a fairy tale or a folk tale. One of the things the book is really about is about the power of telling stories to each other in books, as with the librarians, but also telling stories to each other. So I think about my parents telling me bedtime stories, or many of us telling stories about our ancestors to our children, or sometimes people tell each other stories when it's not safe to write them down, right? You whisper something quietly. And all of that, I think, helped me find the tone. In the novel, Bird goes looking for his mother, and he imagines himself as a character in a fairy tale. And it's often the third son of the king, or the miller's poor son who has nothing but a cat, or whatever. And he thinks of those stories. And part of the way that he finds his mother is by remembering the stories that she told him. They guide him and they help him figure out who he's supposed to be. It's not a spoiler to say he realizes that he's not exactly the hero of this story. But that's the tone that I wanted. I wanted a sense of that maybe this is a story that someone is now telling to you.
So, in a sense, a children's book as well. It is told in large parts by a child.
Yeah. It starts, I think, with a child who is 12, so he's right on the border of starting to become an adult. I think for many of us, 12 is the age where you first realize that there was all this history before you existed. And you also start to realize that your parents had a life before you existed, and that there may be people beyond just your parents. I definitely had that realization around that age. And I think what happens then is you get a bigger sense of the world, and you have more context, and you have to figure out who you are in this bigger picture of the world. You start to understand not what your place is, but maybe who you are and how you fit in. So the novel starts, I think, with a fairly simple tone. Bird is quite young, and he observes very closely the way that children do. Adults learn not to see things. We learn to ignore a lot of things because we have to go to work. We have to get things done. We've seen it before. But for children, I think a lot of things are new, and they can see it very clearly. But they don't always understand it. They don't always have the context to understand it. And so we see a lot of what Bird sees, and we understand it a way he doesn't. And as he starts to look for his mother, he starts to understand more. And we learn her story, and he learns her story, and everything becomes a little more complicated. So he becomes an adult, I think, over the course of the book in some ways.
Interesting. I think I just noticed it becomes less of a fairy tale as well throughout the text. In the beginning, it is quite a classical fairy tale. I had reminiscences of in fact, Star Wars and Grimm's Tales, although with a lot less violence, obviously. But there's plenty of reflection, in fact, on fairy tales as well. What I did want to ask you was, where the fairy tales influence, I couldn't place them. It wasn't specifically European, it wasn't specifically Asian, and that to me made the horror of the text a lot more palpable, because this is not a specific American text. This could just as well be anywhere in the world.
Yeah, I think the stories that I wanted to draw on are stories that I think go across cultures. So there's a part where Bird is going into an old house. I promise I won't spoil anything. But he's going into a house that no one has been in. in a long time. And he thinks of himself like the prince in Sleeping Beauty. And he remembers the words where he's going into the vines have overgrown the tower. And this was taking me back to my high school German classes where we did a unit on fairy tales, so I'm really good with that verb tense. And I remember the words for like which is not very useful in, let's say, like modern day Zurich. But I was thinking of those sorts of things, but those were part of my life. But there are also Asian fairy tales and folk tales that were part of my life. There's one folk tale at the center of the book that has to do with cats. And that's a folk tale, I guess, that I remembered reading when I was a child. So there's a blurring of these things, and in part it's because Bird is more than one thing. He's not just a European American. He also has an Asian heritage. His mother is a Chinese American, and she tells him a folk tale that is not even from her culture, but one that she learned elsewhere too. I'm interested in the ideas that sometimes more of these influences come into us than we realize, that we're more than one thing at one time.
We're going to come back to the cat story in any case, but let's quickly talk about librarians.
Yes.
It's almost a love letter to librarians.
I like them.
Of course, they are awesome in real life as well, but there was this wonderful moment in the text where I'm going to have to quote this. They probably teach you that most plantation owners were kind to their slaves and that Columbus discovered America, don't they? Because telling you what really happened would be espousing un-American views, and we certainly wouldn't want them. There's this clarity that, of course, only a librarian can bring. And this part of the text, because maybe in the passage that we just heard, there are these activists around, right? And they make actions all over the States. They paint stuff, and you never know who they are. I thought it was the librarians. It was so obvious to me. Am I completely off track?
I think there are different ways to be activists, and so again, I won't spoil anything, but the librarians are one of the groups that are trying to fix the situation that they're in. They're trying to help the families who have had children taken away. And so they're doing certain things. And I think they look at the art protests, I guess, the yarn, as you heard in the part that Pilu read, as almost an entertainment, like a show, right? There's a little tension between this question of, well, are you actually doing something, or are you just entertaining people? Are you just performing? And I think that's something that many people, including me, have asked themselves in the past few years. At the beginning of the pandemic in particular, I was having a little bit of an existential crisis because I was feeling very useless as a writer, and particularly a fiction writer. I was thinking if I was a doctor, I could be in the hospital helping people. If I were a scientist, I could be working on the vaccine. And instead, I am with my laptop making up stories. And it did not feel good. It felt, I didn't write for a while because I was thinking about these things. And most of my friends that were writers were struggling with the same questions. And eventually what I realized is that different people can help in different ways. So I can't be a doctor. I would be a terrible doctor. I don't like blood. But maybe one thing that I can do is maybe the writing that I do can help in a different way. And I realized that one way I was getting through the early days of the pandemic, so like March, April, May 2020, where everyone was just inside and everything was terrible. I was turning to art for that. I was reading my favorite poems for comfort, but also for inspiration. One of my favorite poems is by a woman named Muriel Rukeyser. And she wrote a poem in the 1970s that I loved so much, I typed it up and I hung it over my desk so I could read it when I was feeling my existential crisis. Because that poem starts, I lived in the first century of world wars. And then the next line is, most mornings I would be more or less insane. And she continues to talk about how essentially the news is making her crazy and she can't work. And she's just calling her friends and they can't work because they're all so upset about the news. But by the end of the poem, she gets to work. And what gets her to work is thinking about the future, thinking about maybe this poem will reach someone who needs to hear it. So I was turning to art, other books, things like that, to write, and that came into the story, I think. This idea that some people will be activists by being in the trenches, so to speak. They will be, getting arrested and they will be protesting, and we need that. But that other people maybe will be helping or trying to make change in other ways, depending on who they are. That's kind of where I settled in the end.
But they seem almost magical, right? They know everything. They are, in a sense, responsible for the distribution of the original poem. The original poem apparently wasn't very successful, and it's actually the librarians who hand it out.
Well, I think the librarians they have a particular goal in mind, right? I don't think this spoils too much. They're trying to figure out where these children have been taken. And when I started to imagine who in this world would care about this information, who would try to get information and gather it and keep it and get it to the people who need it, librarians were the first who came to mind. I grew up going to the public library. I would go with my father for like a Saturday afternoon, and we would just spend hours there. And it was really magical to be told as a child, here's all this information. You can have any of it. It's all yours for the taking, whatever you want. And I think that's really powerful. And when I got older, even now, I sometimes take my computer and I write in the public library. And I hear the librarians talking to the patrons. And I'm astonished at how patient and thorough they are at helping people find what they need. People come in and they say, I have never filed my taxes and I need to file my taxes. Can you help me? And I've heard this. And the librarians say, sure, we will find you the form. We will find you the instructions. I will help you. We will find out where to send your taxes. They walk them through it. I've heard people come in saying, I'm looking for a book. I don't know exactly what it's called, and I don't know who it's by. But I think it's blue, and there's a girl named Sarah in it. And the librarians go, okay, well, here are some options, and they will just do their best. One time I was in the library, and I heard a librarian on the telephone talking to someone who I realized was maybe older or not good with computers, because the other person wanted to get directions from where she was to this other place that turned out to be like 7 blocks away. And the librarian was walking her very patiently for about 20 minutes through, okay, so open an internet browser. Do you know what a browser is? Okay, do you see anything that looks like a circle with a red fox around it? Okay, so click on that. Okay, nothing. Try clicking on it again. Two times really fast. She went so long. And eventually, finally, after 3 or 4 tries, she said, should I just read you the directions and you can write them down? And that was what they did. And I thought, the dedication to saying, if you want information of any kind, for whatever reason, I will help you get it. I mean, that's why the librarians were the superheroes in the book, as you say it. I think they're not they're not concerned with, they're not really concerned with the poems or the things like that. They're really concerned about, here's information. Who needs this information? And if we can't use it now, we'll save it because later it will be useful.
Don't tell any government. They're going to start firing librarians. It's obvious.
Well, in the U.S., this is another case where I'm not psychic. I didn't predict this. What happened was I looked at history when I realized I was going to be writing about an authoritarian government. It felt very important to learn about other times in the past that this has happened. And there are patterns that you see. Similar things tend to happen. And I had already finished the book, and we had sent it to the printer when, in the U.S., people started attacking librarians and telling them they needed to remove certain books, and actually physically threatening librarians. And it was a case where I think history repeats itself because we don't like to learn from it.
I think this would be a moment to get back to the children. Peter will read us a second part. Do you want to quickly?
Yeah. So the second part is about a friend of Bird's. Her name is Sadie, and she's a similar age. But she has been separated from her parents. And so from her, Bird learns some of what happens in his world. I think that's enough.
Sie kam am Abend, hatte Sadie gesagt, nach dem Essen. Sie hatte gerade geduscht und sich ein Handtuch umgewickelt, als es an der Tür klingelte. Ihre Mutter kämmte Sadies Haar, das dick und lockig war und leicht verfilzte. Und unten hörten sie ihren Vater schreien. Dann die Stimmen von Fremden. Ein Mann, 2 Männer. Sadies Mutter hatte gerade eine Haarsträhne in der Hand, die sie vorsichtig durchkämmte, und daran erinnerte sich Sadie am deutlichsten. Ein verirrter Wassertropfen lief ihr den Nacken hinunter, als die ruhige Hand ihrer Mutter vorsichtig einen Knoten entwirrte. Sie hat nicht gezittert, sagte Sadie mit Stolz in der Stimme. Kein bisschen. Vielleicht wusste sie nicht, was vor sich ging, sagte Bird. Sadie schüttelte den Kopf. Sie wusste es, erwiderte sie. Ihre Mutter schlang die Arme um sie, presste ihre Lippen auf Sadies Stirn. Sadie hatte noch nicht begriffen, was geschah, aber eine große Angst überkam sie wie ein Frösteln auf feuchter Haut. Sie schmiegte sich an ihre Mutter und vergrub das Gesicht so fest in ihren weichen Hals, dass sie kaum atmen konnte. »Vergiss uns nicht, okay?« hat ihre Mutter gesagt, und auch als die Badezimmertür geöffnet wurde, war Sadie noch verwirrt. Ein Mann in Polizeiuniform. Unten brüllte Sadies Vater immer noch. Wie sich herausstellte, waren es 4 Polizisten. 2 blieben unten bei ihrem Vater, einer blieb oben bei ihrer Mutter und einer stand Wache vor Sadies Zimmer, während sie sich anzog. Da sie nicht genau wusste, was sie tun sollte, zog sie ihren gestreiften Regenbogen-Pyjama an, als ginge sie zu Bett wie an jedem anderen Tag. »Lassen Sie sie doch noch mal ins Zimmer und sich umziehen«, hatte ihre Mutter gesagt, als Sadie in den Flur kam. »Lassen Sie mich wenigstens Ihr Haar flechten.« Doch der Mann im Flur schüttelte den Kopf. »Ab jetzt«, sagte er, »sind Sie nicht mehr für sie verantwortlich.« Er legte seine Hand auf Sadies Schulter und führte sie die Treppe hinunter. Sadie begriff, dass etwas Schreckliches geschah, war aber gleichzeitig überzeugt, dass es nicht wirklich sein konnte. Sie wollte sich zu ihrer Mutter umdrehen, um einen Hinweis zu bekommen, ob sie schreien, sich wehren, weglaufen oder gehorchen sollte, sah aber nur einen Arm ihrer Mutter, weil ihr die breite blaue Brust des Polizisten die Sicht versperrte. Und so erinnerte sie sich daran, was ihre Mutter ihr immer gesagt hatte. Sei besonders vorsichtig in der Nähe von Polizisten. Sag bitte und danke und Ma'am und Sir. Was immer du tust, verärgere sie nicht. Man hatte sie in ein großes schwarzes Auto verfrachtet. Ein Polizist hatte sie auf dem Rücksitz angeschnallt und sie hatte gesagt, danke. Nachdem sie weggefahren waren, nachdem man sie zum Bahnhof, dann zum Flughafen, dann in eine Pflegefamilie gebracht hatte und ihr klar war, sie würde nicht wieder nach Hause kommen, hatte sie dieses Danke bedauert und auch, dass sie so still gegangen war. Ihre Pflegeeltern wollten ihr einen neuen Namen geben, einen neuen Namen für einen neuen Anfang. Doch das hatte sie strikt abgelehnt. Ich heiße Sadie, sagt sie. 2 Wochen lang versuchten sie, Sadie zu überzeugen, doch am Ende gaben sie auf. So vieles war neu in dieser ersten Zeit. Gegen einiges, neue Familie, neues Haus, neue Stadt, neues Leben, konnte Sadie nichts unternehmen. Also widersetzte sie sich in den wenigen Bereichen, in denen sie es konnte. Auf dem Weg zur Schule blieb sie stehen, zog das rüschenbesetzte Kleid aus, das ihre Pflegeeltern ihr gekauft hatten, ließ es auf dem Rasen liegen und ging den Rest des Wegs in Unterwäsche. Ein Anruf von der Direktorin, eine strenge Predigt von ihren Pflegeeltern. Am nächsten Morgen tat sie es wieder. Seht ihr, sagten alle, was waren das für Eltern? Das Mädchen ist praktisch eine Wilde. Ihre zweite Pflegemutter wollte ihre dichten Lockenkopf entwirren. Wir müssen es glätten, sagte sie verzweifelt. Und am Abend, als alle schliefen, schlich Sadie nach unten und holte die Küchenschere. Von da an trug sie ihr Haar in einem kurzen Lockenkranz um den Kopf. Ich weiß nicht, was wir mit dir machen sollen, sagte die Pflegemutter einmal zu einer Freundin, als sie dachte, Sadie würde es nicht hören. Irgendwie liegt ihr überhaupt nichts an ihrem Äußeren. Es waren nette Leute, die es gut meinten. Von der Regierung als geeignete Eltern ausgewählt. Als Menschen mit anständigem Charakter, die gute patriotische Werte vermitteln konnten. Irgendetwas stimmt nicht mit ihr, hörte Sadie ihre letzte Pflegemutter am Telefon sagen. Das wöchentliche Kontrollgespräch mit der Sozialarbeiterin, die nach Hinweisen suchte, ob Sadie bleiben konnte. In der ganzen Zeit, die sie hier ist, hat sie nicht einmal geweint. Ich habe mich sogar vor ihr Zimmer gesetzt und die ganze Nacht gehorcht. Sie weint nicht. Jetzt sagen Sie mir, welches Kind macht so etwas durch und weint nicht ein einziges Mal? Ja, glaube ich auch. Welche Eltern muss sie gehabt haben, dass sie so kalt und gefühllos ist? Sie hatte geseufzt. Ja, wir tun, was wir tun können, sagte sie. Wir versuchen, den Schaden zu reparieren, der angerichtet worden ist. Ein paar Wochen später ein Brief, den Sadie im Schreibtisch ihrer Pflegemutter gefunden hatte. In Anbetracht der schweren emotionalen Schäden, die das Kind durch die frühere häusliche Situation erlitten hat, wird eine dauerhafte Herausnahme aus der Stammfamilie empfohlen. Ständiges Sorgerecht für die Pflegeeltern. Und es stimmte. Sadie weinte nie. Ein paar Mal hatte sie Bird Briefe an ihre alte Adresse mitgegeben, hingekritzelt auf Notizpapier. Aber der letzte war mit dem Stempel Empfänger unbekannt zurückgekommen. Und auch da hatte Bird sie nicht weinen sehen. Manchmal jedoch, wenn er sie in der Ecke des Spielplatzes kauern sah, den Kopf an den Maschendrahtzaun gelehnt, drehte er sich weg, damit sie nicht so tun musste, als wäre sie tapfer. Um sie allein mit ihrem Kummer zu lassen oder mit der Last, unter der sie ihn begrub.
Let's talk about the differences between these two characters, Sadie and Bird. They're almost complete opposites, right?
Yeah, I think in some ways they're two different ways of approaching a situation. Sadie, as you can probably tell from the passage, does not like to go quietly. She really wants to put up a fight. You know, if they tell her you have to wear this dress, she takes it off and goes to school naked. In part, that's because of how her parents have raised her, and you learn more about them in the book. Bird, I think, has always been taught to fly under the radar, so to speak, to not attract attention. And in part, that's because of how his parents have raised him. His mother is a Chinese American, and his father is white and is now raising his mixed son alone. And one of the ways that he wants to protect his part Asian child in a world that's quite dangerous for him, is to tell him to try not to attract attention, essentially to try to blend in. And the two ways that these children move through the world in some ways is testing out how far each method can take you. It's not that there's a right and a wrong, but that both of them come with serious drawbacks.
When you say blend in, it goes a bit further than that, right? There is these strategies of almost self-erasure, never be noticed, and which are in fact the same strategies that are used by the foster parents against Sadie. We change your name, we change your hairdo, but they are self-imposed in Bird's case.
Yeah, he's told, don't attract attention, as you heard, just stay away from policemen, always follow the same path, just don't break any of the rules. And it's a way of, I think, asking him to make himself smaller. Mm-hmm. And there's this scene later where he does break some of the rules, and he starts to get a sense of a new kind of freedom. In a way, what his father is doing with really good intentions is asking him to hide all the parts of himself that come from his mother. And of course, with his mother, there's also a racial component, right? His mother is the Chinese one. And the idea, for example, that he has to not talk about his mother, that it's quite dangerous for him to have anything to do with the Chinese part of himself. It's not an accident. I think there's a real desire for his father to protect him and to say, well, maybe you can just blend in and not be that. I have a mixed son. His father is white, and I'm a Chinese American. And I think about these questions because when my son is when he's with his father, he's seen by other people as being multiracial. And when he's with me, he's seen as being just Asian. And it's interesting the way that people will treat him differently or speak to him differently. And at the same time, I know that my son's experience is certainly different from my husband's, right? My husband is a tall, white American man between the ages of 18 and 50, the most powerful demographic. And I'm a Chinese woman. His experience will also be different from mine because he's more than one thing. And this is something I think about, as you can tell, and it's something that I think Bird is trying to work out for himself. How do you hold on to all of the parts of who you are? When are you allowed to be more than one thing?
But isn't it as well a strategy in coping with racism? There is some reflection in the text as well, how that is very different for very specific groups. Asians having a completely different experience in the United States than black people.
Yeah, I think it's different for several reasons, but I do know that for a long time, the way that Asians particularly tried to, if not blend in, tried to avoid trouble was to Americanize. The word when I was growing up was assimilate, which is a hard thing to do when no matter how long you've lived here, people will see your face and think you are a foreigner, which is a thing that happens to me. I think every Asian person that I know in America, and maybe other places too, has had the question of, where are you from, right? And my answer, because I'm difficult, is always, I'm from Boston. And then they say, well, but where did you grow up? And I say, oh, Cleveland. And then they're like, okay, no, but where were you born? And at this point, it's clear to both of us what they're really asking. And I say, oh, I was born in Pittsburgh. These are maybe like two of the most boring cities in the United States. But there's that sense, as you say, there was an idea for a long time, I think, that if you only spoke English and if you acted as American as possible, that you could avoid trouble and people would accept you. And I think that it's become more clear in recent years that that's not always possible, if it's ever possible.
But is it a historical thing? I mean, you said
Yeah.
you researched as well, and there's a lot of in the text.
It is. It's. I don't want you to think that the text is full of research, but I learned a lot, honestly, about Asian American history, and there is a long history of the question of can Asian Americans, and particularly Chinese Americans, can they ever become American? Mm-hmm. And for a long time, America's answer was no. You can never really be American. And in fact, the only laws that were passed to limit immigration by race were against the Chinese. So there were laws that said that you cannot come, or, if you're Chinese. And so there's been a very long history ever since Chinese came to America, which was actually quite early, of can you ever be American enough to satisfy them? If you wear a flag, is that enough? And the answer so far has been no. So there is a long history of that, of people trying that and then realizing the limitations of it. I don't know if I actually answered your question.
No, I'm not sure if I actually finished formulating the question before you started answering, but that's all good. There has probably never been such a specific case of what you are describing than what was done to Asian people during the Second World War in the United States, and this is something that is still practically impossible to talk about in the States.
So I think you're referring to Japanese internment.
Exactly.
Which,
although has to be said, did not only include Japanese people,
yes.
but as you describe in your text as well, they just kind of whatever looks Asian, it gets put in.
Yeah, I think it's important to say that during World War II, the government decided that it was important to round up anyone of Japanese descent, which included Americans who had been born in the country and had never lived anywhere else, and put them into what were truly concentration camps in the desert. And there were a lot of we are still feeling the effects of that in a lot of ways, because many of those people lost their businesses, for example, because they were gone. People came in and took their businesses and their livelihoods, and they lost all of their property. And it's very complicated, and it is something that in America we still have trouble talking about. We don't talk about it. Because my parents are Asian American, my mother thought it was very important for me to know about this. And she bought me books when I was a child about Japanese internment, which was maybe questionable for a young child. But I think she thought it was important that I know. And I understand why, because when I got to high school, I learned that almost nobody even knew this had happened. It was something that I think people felt ashamed of, rightly so, but decided to ignore. And even now, there is a lot of resistance about talking about this. There have been a number of anniversaries of this, and in the news every time there is a debate about, well, is it fair to say that they were in a concentration camp? Maybe we should just call it internment. Maybe internment is not even fair. Maybe we should just say it was a residential camp. There's real resistance to looking at everything that happened. And that's the context, I think, that I wanted to write about.
That is some heavy stuff. If I may go even further in that direction, if we get back to the 2018 moment, I found it quite astonishing that there was such protest in the US. US is not a very protesting country. Maybe this is my European perspective.
No, I think that's fair.
But the moment where they take away children, that's where people break. And
some people broke, but some people were like, well, this is fair. Mm-hmm. They asked for it. And that was astonishing to me, to find that there were people some who would defend, but then many more who would just not engage entirely. And that was the part that really frightened me. I was glad people were talking about it, but I was astonished at how many people were so uncomfortable with what was happening that they just said, I can't even think about that. I don't read the news anymore. And many people said that. That was one of the questions that I think I ended up thinking about in the book. When I go to a book, I don't have answers. And when I come out, I don't know if I have answers either, but I know what my questions are. And one of my questions was, how far can people let things go before they can no longer pretend it's not happening? And where is the border between ignoring and collaborating and assisting, right? Those are very blurry questions, and I think they're again the questions that we've seen in a lot of times of history, right? Certainly in World War II, certainly, in the time of Stalin. There's the question of if you're not protesting, right? If you're letting it happen, are you also responsible? That's one of the questions I'm thinking about.
Absolutely. And what is the crime that is actually being performed? This is not just breaking up family. The strategies in place here are to efface complete cultures. We've had our own case in Switzerland where Roma and Sinti children were taken away from their parents with a clear goal of taking them out of a culture that was, well, we don't want this here. Yeah.
And certainly you were not alone. I mean, in the United States, in Canada, the Pope was just recently in Canada to try and make some apologies and reparations for taking away the Indigenous children there, and in Australia and many, many other places. I think, one of the things that brought me into this book was feeling like we were seeing history repeating, but wanting to know why and how can we continue to hope? Why should we continue to, make things better? Because I was asking that myself, especially as a parent. The world felt pretty dark. It still feels pretty dark. But every morning, I have to suggest to my son that he get up and continue learning things and continue trying to be a kind person, that he continue learning, and that it's possible for the future to be better. And so, oddly, from researching all these things, one of the things I found in learning about all of these cases where this has happened before is I oddly felt a sense of hope, as weird as that sounds, because there have always been people, I think, who were trying to stop that. And even if they weren't able to, the fact that people were always saying, this is not right. I can see this is not right. And it's important to try and say and do something about it. That made me oddly hopeful in a way, that even in the darkest times that came before, there were still people who stood up in a way. And so I think of the book actually as being about the search for when everything bad is happening. How do you maintain that hope?
We're going to get back to that point in a second. This is a perfect moment for the third reading part, in fact. Do you want to give some additional context?
So the third is the library, right?
Yeah.
So Bird is, I should have brought my own book with me. It's upstairs. So Bird is he's looking for his mother. He's trying to understand the world that he's in, but he's also trying to figure out, is there anything I can do, or is the world just downhill from here? And one of the things that happens is he gets help along the way. And this is a moment where he goes into the library and he's looking for the story that his mother has told him a long time ago. He thinks that's going to be the key to finding her. And this is the first step in him stepping out into the world and starting to figure out what he can do.
Bird späht die Ecke. Die Tür nach draußen ist spaltbreit geöffnet. Jemand muss draußen sein und schnell heimlich eine rauchen. Und wie er gehofft hatte, ist auch die ins Magazin führende Tür einen Spalt breit geöffnet. Ihm bleibt nicht viel Zeit. So leise wie möglich schleicht er den Flur entlang und öffnet die Magazintür etwas weiter. Sie quietscht leicht. Er blickt über die Schulter, ob der Raucher es bemerkt hat. Keine Bewegung. Bird atmet tief durch und schlüpft hinein. Er braucht eine Weile, um sich zu orientieren. Die Titel um ihn herum sind in einer Sprache, die er nicht kennt, mit Wörtern, von denen er nicht weiß, wie man sie ausspricht. Sine wolne umesu, pitania zadawane subir. Er flitzt in einen der Gänge und geht weiter nach oben, weg von der Tür. Wer immer dort draußen raucht, wird bald zurückkommen, und dann sollte Bird nicht in der Nähe sein. Im Magazin ist es vollkommen still. Eine absorbierende, wachsame, fast raubtierhafte Ruhe, die darauf wartet, jedes Geräusch aufzusaugen. Eine Angestellte kommt vorbei, Zettel in der Hand, ein Buch unter den Arm geklemmt, während sie in den Regalen nach der Lücke sucht, in die es eingeordnet werden soll. Bird wartet, bis sie sich entfernt, dann huscht er vorbei. Irgendwo muss ein Suchterminal sein, und schließlich entdeckt er eins in der Ecke und gibt auf der Tastatur „Der Junge, der Katzen malte" ein. Eine lange Pause. Dann erscheint eine Nummer auf dem Bildschirm. Er schreibt sie auf einen Zettel und vergleicht sie mit den Tabellen, die neben dem Monitor hängen, fährt mit dem Finger die Liste der Standardnummern nach, unten Ebene D, Vater, 4 Ebenen unter der Erde, Südwestflügel. Bevor er geht, kann er nicht widerstehen, noch eine Suche einzugeben. All unsere verschwundenen Herzen. Wieder eine Pause, länger diesmal. Und dann statt einer Nummer die Mitteilung: ausgelistet. Bird schluckt und löscht den Bildschirm. Dann nimmt er den Zettel und läuft Richtung Treppe. Die Treppe führt ihn am falschen nordöstlichen Ende der Bibliothek nach unten statt am südwestlichen. Aber zumindest ist die Ebene D verlassen. Nur die Hauptkorridore sind erhellt und das nur schwach. In den Quergängen ist es pechschwarz. Ihm war nie bewusst gewesen, wie riesig die Bibliothek ist. Ein ganzer Häuserblock. Hunderte von Metern mal Hunderte von Metern. Dazwischen Kilometer von Regalen. Ihm fällt ein, was sein Vater einmal sagte: Die Regale ringsum sind nicht nur Platzhalter für Bücher, sie bilden auch das Skelett des Gebäudes und halten die Bibliothek aufrecht. Er kommt zu dem Schluss, dass es am einfachsten ist, am Rand zu bleiben. Wenn er im Zickzack läuft, verirrt er sich bestimmt. Vorsichtig bahnt er sich seinen Weg an der Wand Richtung Süden entlang. Es ist nicht so einfach, wie er gehofft hatte. Manchmal ragt ein Stapel alter Stühle oder Tische vor ihm auf und er muss seitlich über mehrere Gänge ausweichen und wieder zurückfinden. Irgendwo über ihm poltern Schritte durch Ebene C. Ein Ofen springt an und ein Hauch warmer Luft strömt wie ein Geysir durch den vergitterten Boden. Bird passiert Regal um Regal, steckt seine Finger in die Lücken, in denen die entfernten Bücher früher standen. Hier unten fehlen weniger als in der öffentlichen Bibliothek, wo in manchen Regalen mehr Lücken sind als Bücher. Dennoch fehlt in fast jedem Regal mindestens eins, manchmal mehrere. Er überlegt, wer wohl entschied, welche Bücher zu gefährlich waren, um sie aufzubewahren, und wer die verdammten Bücher jagen und einsammeln musste, um sie wie ein Henker ihrem Verderben zuzuführen. Sein Vater wohl möglich? Am richtigen Regal wird er langsamer, hält dann inne und überfliegt die abwärts nummerierten Signaturen entlang der sauber ausgerichteten Buchrücken. Und da ist es, schmal und gelb, fast kein Buch, kaum größer als eine Zeitschrift. Fast hätte er es übersehen. Mit einem Finger schnippte er es aus dem Regal. Der Junge, der Katzen malte, ein japanisches Volksmärchen. Und dieses Buch hat er noch nie gesehen, doch ein Blick auf den Umschlag sagt ihm, es ist dieselbe Geschichte. Ein japanisches Volksmärchen, das seine chinesische Mutter irgendwo gehört oder gelesen, sich daran erinnert ihm erzählt hat. Vorne ist eine Aquarellzeichnung von einem Jungen, einem japanischen Jungen, der einen Pinsel hält. Er malt eine riesige Katze auf eine Wand. Der Junge sieht Bird sogar ein wenig ähnlich, dunkles Haar, das ihm wirr in die Stirn hängt, die gleichen dunklen Augen, leicht rundliche Nase. Ihm fällt wieder ein, wie seine Mutter die Geschichte erzählte, wie etwas vor langer Zeit in Styropor verpacktes, das er ausgräbt und ans Licht holt. Ein Junge, der allein und weit entfernt von zu Hause umherwandert. Ein seltsames Gebäude in der Dunkelheit. Katze um Katze um Katze entspringt den Haaren seines Pinsels. Birds Finger zittern, als er den Einband von den stoffweichen Seiten darunter lösen will. Ja, denkt er, es ist fast da, wie etwas, das vorsichtig aus dem Schatten tritt und allmählich Gestalt annimmt. Sobald er es liest, wird er sich daran erinnern und wissen, was in dieser Geschichte seiner Mutter passiert. Gleich wird er alles verstehen. Im selben Augenblick legt sich eine Hand auf seine Schulter und er wirbelt herum und sieht seinen Vater.
You mentioned just before we went into that part the hope that could spring from such a text. The passage we just heard has a lot about the power of books. I just noticed this detail just now. The books even hold up the roof of the library.
Yeah, that's a true fact, actually, about this library. But it felt like such a good metaphor. I had to put it in. The idea that the books are literally what is giving the building its strength. It was a perfect metaphor for the way that this story, in a way, gives Bird this ability to sort of figure out how he's going to move forward.
But you're ascribing a lot of power to literature in this text. Poetry can create protests and, in fact, maybe even create political change. I guess it must be able to do that, otherwise governments wouldn't be so afraid of good literature.
I think so. I think it sounds a bit funny when you say it that way, right? But if you think about the times that authoritarians have started to come to power, one of the first things they do is they crack down on artists, who you don't think of generally as being a particularly wealthy or powerful group necessarily. But in some ways, I think that's a recognition of the power that art of all kinds can have. One of the things that makes art really valuable is that it can hold open a space for possibility. It can give you an idea that the world could be different than the way it is. And I think that's why it is so scary to fascism. It's the opposite, in a sense. If fascism is saying, this is the way that you must do things, there is only one way, and if you don't do it that way, you will be punished in some way. Art is opening up all kinds of cracks and saying, maybe it could be this way, maybe it could be that way, maybe this story could happen, maybe that story could happen. In a way, it's almost the polar opposite. And so when we think about it that way, it seems it's less silly than it sounds, right? And if we think also about even political protests that have happened recently, many times they draw from the arts too, right? There are songs. I remember in there was a while in the Arab Spring where Seven Nation Army by the White Stripes, if any of you knew this song, was a protest song, and people were singing that. My family comes from Hong Kong, so I watch what's happening over there with great personal interest. But one of the things that happens over there are particular... my mother calls them Hong Kong anthems, but they're not an official anthem. It's just like a popular song about how great Hong Kong is, basically. But it's just like a drinking song. People sing it at weddings sometimes. Uncles are drunk. But they're singing about their love for Hong Kong, and this has become a protest song. And then quickly thereafter, it's become illegal to sing that in public places. And you can see how what seems like it would be innocuous can be given sort of great power. So I think we sometimes underestimate how much power art or poetry or any of this can really have.
And there is, of course, the analogy in the fairy tale about the boy who paints the cats. His own fictional creations kill the monster.
Yeah. This is a folktale that I remember from my childhood. It's come back to me over the years, but I read it differently each time, or I remember it differently. And when I went looking for that copy of the book that I remembered, I can't find it. I found other retellings with other pictures, and none of them are the one that I remember. And I asked my sister, do you remember this book? And she said, no, kind of. I don't think we had it in the house. You must have gotten it at the library. And I asked my mother, and she said, I have no clue what you're talking about. And so it's odd to feel that there is this story that I know I remember, but I don't remember all of it. And it has a lot of meaning for me. It is, for me, one meaning is that art can have a power. It can literally come to life and fight a monster and protect you in some way. It can do something. And yet, it doesn't have that same meaning for my mother and my sister. And the versions that I remember are not exactly what I have. I think this is what makes the fairy tale so fascinating, that the story is the same, but we lay our own understanding over it, and we make a meaning out of it, depending on where we are. That's partly what happens to Bird, and that's partly what happens to his mother as well.
And there is in fact criticism of this in the text itself. One of the parents who then talks to Margaret promises to tell, she will tell her the story of her child, but only if she will tell it as it is, not as a fictional recreation, not as art, but as the story as it was.
Yeah, there's a lot of thinking about what it can do to tell someone's story in particular, even a very particular person's story, and to share that experience and to testify. And for Margaret, that's one of the things that she realizes she might need to do.
I just realized now that we wanted to talk about Margaret Atwood as well.
We did.
We totally forgot about that. But speaking of anti-fascist strategies, it was quite striking that the main character, or one of the main characters' name is Margaret.
It's Margaret, which I think you, as many people, assumed was that it was a nod to Margaret Atwood. The secret is that it's actually a nod to my mother. The story. So my mother's name is not Margaret. So now I will explain. I was going through old pictures of my parents, and I found one, and it had this note on the back, to Margaret, and it was my father's handwriting, and I went, "Who is this? Why is he writing to Margaret, which is not my mother's name?" And she said, "No, that's me. That's my confirmation name. And when we met, that was the name that he knew me by." And it was very startling to think that she had this whole other self, in a way, that I hadn't known about. And so I actually named the character for my mother in that way, because part of the story is Bird realizing that his mother has this other side to her, that she's had a life before him. And, of course, once I thought, well, Margaret is a good name for this character, I thought, and I like that it's a nod, it's a tip of the hat to Margaret Atwood. There's other resonances to the name that I like a lot. Saint Margaret, for example, who is, in the Catholic tradition, she's swallowed by a dragon, right? And she's got a crucifix in her hand, and so it regurgitates her, and she defeats the dragon that way. There's a lot there. The more I thought about it, the more that name felt like the only name that I could have for this character who is all of these things.
It felt very fitting. It seemed to me to be a Handmaid's Tale, even though the themes obviously are very different. But the fear it produced in me while reading it was on a very similar level.
Yeah, and I certainly did look at The Handmaid's Tale, because I had never written a book that wasn't strictly realistic before, and I was nervous. I didn't know how to do it. And because I'm a nerd, I decided to do my homework. And so I went back and I reread a lot of other dystopias. So I reread The Handmaid's Tale. I reread Fahrenheit 451. I reread Brave New World, and then I read more recent, I don't know if they still count as dystopias. There's a book called Red Clocks by Lenny Zumas. And the premise of that is that abortion is illegal in the United States. So I don't know if we can still call that a dystopia. But I wanted to learn how do you create a world that is not ours, but feels like it could be ours. And one of the lessons I learned was something Margaret Atwood said about The Handmaid's Tale. She said, if I made an imaginary garden, I want the toads in the garden to be real. And what she meant was that all of the bad things that happen in the novel have a link to real life. And I tried to take that as my role as well. So everything that's in there has a precedent in real life, because I didn't want people to say, well, that would never happen. There's aliens in this book, so it's clearly a fantasy. I wanted them to think, how much of a dystopia is it?
Mm-hmm. I throw an eye at our boss.
We should.
Would you like to take some questions from the crowd?
I would. I love having questions, but only if you want to ask them. They can. Oh, good, you do.
Wow.
It's like ask about this book, about other books, about writing, life, whatever. Oh, okay.
Was okay, right?
Thank you. Thank you for all of your wonderful books. I'm a big fan. I was wondering, you just mentioned some of the works of fiction that you've read, and I was wondering if part of your research you have read also this book by Trevor Noah, where he describes being a child that looks neither like the mom and the dad, and he has to like hide himself, and his grandma's not letting him play outside. And when actually Peter read that, that sentence of like the dad telling him to follow the path, that really made me think about that.
I love that comparison. I haven't read Trevor Noah's book, and it's on my very tall stack of books to read. But I think that's a common feeling in some ways of having to disguise yourself. I think when you belong in more than one place, sometimes you feel like you don't belong in either place. And I think that's something that happens often to people who are multiracial, or in other ways feel that they're other. You have to find ways to camouflage yourself, but there's also a cost to doing that. I think that's a great comparison. Thank you. You have other?
Hi, thank you for coming out and thank you for requesting masks.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, earlier you were talking about how this is basically a domestic novel with political themes, or that you bring the political into the domestic, and I was just wondering if you see that as a particularly feminist approach, perhaps, or how that, where that might come from.
I like this question. I think it's maybe an accidentally feminist approach. I do consider myself a feminist, but I also am stubborn, and I want to write about the things that matter to me. And so my feeling is, I think these things are important, and I'm going to make everybody think they're important too, because they are. So I guess I think that maybe that is a feminist approach in its own way of saying, family seems pretty important to me, and I'm going to tell you why I think it should be important to you too, right? That is of as much value to discuss as the arguments that happen in Congress, for example. I might steal that from you later on in a future thing and say, this is my feminist approach, because I like that a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this visit and very interesting discussion and the very beautiful readings. I have a slightly theoretical or abstract question that I'm curious to get your take on. I haven't read your latest book, but very much enjoyed your previous ones. And I'm interested to hear that the main characters in your new book seem to be children, prepubescent children, if I'm understanding correctly.
12, so right
on that cusp.
On that cusp, yeah.
And I am noticing a trend in contemporary literary fiction, maybe over the past 10 years or so, of an increasing frequency that the main characters or the protagonists in novels, particularly celebrated novels or those that are winning awards or becoming very popular, focus on characters around this age, youngish children who are maybe just about to come of age. And I'm curious if you have also noticed that, or anyone else in the audience has noticed this to be a trend. And it does some sort of odd things, I think, to contemporary literary fiction, because you have then quite a lot of output in which the main characters are sort of, and the tone of the novel is about innocence and the coming of age and seeing the world in this kind of cloudy, through this sort of cloudy perspective in which it becomes increasingly clearer.
That's interesting. I haven't noticed that, honestly. I'm not saying that it isn't true, but I haven't noticed that being a particular trend. But I wonder if what you notice, I think you're making a really interesting observation, is that I wonder if that says something about where we feel we are as a community, species, I don't know. But if we are feeling ourselves in that moment of uncertainty that I think that adolescent age is, if we're feeling that we're struggling with some growing pains as you know, as a culture, as a civilization, it's interesting. I think that there's a long tradition of loosely the coming of age novel. I mean, you can go pretty far back. You know, you can go back to Dickens, for example, where you've got Oliver Twist, who's a child, but quite quickly gets older, David Copperfield, and then you can go, I think you can make the argument that even many of the fairy tales are coming of age stories, not only in the Western tradition, but elsewhere. This is above my pay grade, so to speak, but I wonder if, you know, in 50 or 100 years from now, some historian or some literary critic will look and say, actually, there are these spikes. We see these at different times. I think that's a really interesting question. Thank you. We have time for one more? A really good question. No pressure. No pressure.
I'm not sure. So when I read the book, I was wondering how much it is affected by the situation created by the Corona crisis, because at that time I had a Chinese student, and even here in Zurich, she got in very awkward situations. You know, the talk about China flu. So would you have written the book differently before Corona, or is that something that also affected your situation?
This is a great question, actually a great question. Very good question. Excellent question. I think it's possible that without Corona, I would not have written this book at all. As I said, I started writing it in 2016, and actually when I looked at my old notebooks, I had been thinking about this for some time before it. But as I said, I was nervous because I didn't know if I wanted to spend time in this world. I didn't know if I wanted to spend time thinking about these terrible things that could be happening. The anti-Asian parts of it were in the book from quite early on, well before the pandemic. But I would write it and then I would kind of panic and close the file and work on something else. And in fact, I talked to my agent, and there was another novel that I said, I'm going to work on that. I'll deal with Bird later. I don't know what to do. And then the pandemic happened, and I started thinking back to, so this is March, April, May, when everybody was inside, and I think there was this, where I was, there was this sense that everything might be dangerous. We were like wiping our mail off. I don't know if that was a thing here. Because, and it's funny now, because now we know more. But at the time, we didn't know what to be afraid of. And so we kind of had to be afraid of everything, right? We didn't know was it okay to see your neighbors outside, right? There was this real sense of isolation and the idea that it was just you, and you couldn't see anybody, you couldn't see the people you loved, and everyone was literally alone. And that started to be thinking about Bird, and I realized that might be what it feels like for him. You feel like you can't trust anyone. Everyone might be a danger to you. Even when we began to go outside, people would, if you saw somebody, you'd cross the street. And actually, people are still doing that sometimes. If there's space, everybody will just have their own space. And there was this sense of distrust, and I suddenly started to feel what he might have been feeling much more deeply. And then, as you say, in the U.S., certainly we saw a lot of anti-Asian violence, and really shocking things. There was one incident in New York that there's a scene in the book that's based on it, where there was a person who was stomped on in the middle of Manhattan in the middle of the day, and nobody did anything except for the doorman of the building who came out and closed the door. And that was really terrifying to me, because as a Chinese American, I've always known that violence might be a possibility. There's often moments where I'm going about my day and then someone will yell something at me. And that is true for every Asian person and actually every person of color. This is the term we're using in the US. That's true for everyone that I know. But a lot of people in America were surprised. They said, I didn't know that Asian people faced any racism. And it was not a surprise to me or to any of the Asian people that I knew. And it suddenly felt very important to acknowledge it in the book rather than to shy away from it. And in some ways to witness it, right? To say, like, I see what's happening and I'm going to say, yeah, this is happening. And I'll ask the reader to witness it too. And so, as you said, I don't know if I would have written this book without the pandemic. I actually wrote to my agent in, I think, April. And I said, I know I'm supposed to be finishing this other book, but I think I need to write this book. Please don't be mad. And she wrote back in minutes to say, I actually was going to say the same thing to you. So it was really then that all of the pieces I had started to come together. So thank you. That was a very, very good question. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for the wonderful conversation, and thank you for your wonderful reading. And most of all, thank you to Literature House for hosting, and to all of you for coming and for reading. Thank you.
That was just such a wonderful ending that it's wonderful to give you the last word. Thank you so much for coming to Zurich. Thank you all for being here. There is a small exhibition on the third floor. You can come another day, and here on dystopia and utopia. Oh. And this is basically in this house as one of the oldest libraries in Zurich. I just wanted to add that on a sort of a little optimistic note. There are things that last. And we're very much looking forward to your next visit with your next book in Zurich. Thank you.
Pretty much perfect timing.
I was going to say your timing was very good.
You were comfortable?
Yes.
I'm so sorry about my voice in the beginning. It was like, alles gut. Ja, ja. Was okay? Boss is glad? Good.